It is a dark time for England and her colonial possessions. The King of France's territorial claims to the North American continent are no longer tolerated. War is on the horizon. The rural countryside is threatened and terrorized by outbreaks of violence, with the American colonists seeing fighting on their own soil. The French's hasty alliance with the Indian tribes have made them a formidable and outright dangerous force in the New World. Unlike in the Old, where wars can be fought with impressive armadas and organized legions of troops, America is a frontier of uncertainty, where arms could be drawn at any time. And yet, the colonists search westward, through the Appalachians to land unknown, seeking fortune and glory for the colonies and the crown. France, however, has laid claims to these lands, and the repeated French encroachments has made expansion daunting for the settlers. General Washington, tasked with delivering an ultimatum from Virginia to the French camp, hopes to mitigate tensions while still sending a strong message to his adversaries. The French, however, with their arrogance and starchy attitude, refuse. General Washington is forced to leave the site and report the failure. He returns, however, with even more horsepower and a maddening desire to take what is rightfully Britain's. Overhearing a new and illegal French settlement, he journeys out with 40 soldiers and 10 Indians. The fight over the settlement is brutal and bloody, but the French commander is killed and the area is dismantled. Fearing a counterattack of massive proportions, Washington retreats to the Great Meadows and constructs Fort Necessity. Meanwhile, the French are horrified after hearing the shocking defeat of their men. They assemble their finest soldiers, leaders, and bakers and decide that they will investigate this purported Fort Necessity and take vengeful action. With a grouping of Indians, the French venture through the meadows and arrive at Washington's settlement. In the torrential downpour, the two factions clash. Without clear sights, Washington's army is unable to defend their camp and suffers a barrage of arrows, bullets, and bread. On July 4th, Fort Necessity is surrendered, and Washington and his battered men are allowed to retreat. The transpiring chain of events would set the stage for the French and Indian War, where the French, supported by their native allies, engaged in repeated conflict with the British Army. In the next Battle of Fort Duquesne, the French and Indians laid waste to Britain's force of 1,300 men, killing all but 300 troops in 3 hours. With formal war underway, conflict tears towards North America. Forts Oswego, Ticonderoga, and William Henry fall to the French. The continued assault by the Indians leaves the British forces in constant peril and uncertainty, but after a successful victory at Louisbourg, they are able to make peace with the Iroquois, Shawnee, and Delaware Indians. British forces then ravage the French on a blazing path towards Canada, sacking Guadeloupe, Ontario, and recapturing Duquesne. The French evacuate key positions along Lake Ontario, leaving their troops stranded and confused in the Ohio Valley. Though slow and tedious, the British secure their victory in the Treaty of Paris. Though the British secured victory, they did so at an extraordinarily hefty price. Britain was essentially bankrupt. The war effort proved costly, as the Crown was forced to fight a tremendous war spanning 2 continents. Though the Treaty of Paris paid tribute to Britain's incredible efforts, it did not, however, grant the nation any additional funds to pay off their war debts. For this, they looked instead to the colonies, which they sacrificed their treasury to protect. The king instituted taxes in the colonies for what he deemed to be their colonial war and was adamant that they pay off their debts in full. This was to be done firstly through a sugar tax, the first of many important taxes in which the colonists eventually submitted to. Seeing the resentment and anger caused by the simple tax, the king began to worry about a possible insurrection. By limiting western expansion past the Appalachians, he believed he could tighten his control over the colonies and their acquisition of power. The Proclamation of 1763 reserved the former French and Indian land as hunting grounds, which upset and confused the colonists. After seeing continued backlash for his policies, the king gave his colonial governors stronger control to rewrite legislature and carry, potentially, unchecked executive power. The king had drawn the battle lines through a new battlefield, and confrontation was only beginning. Both in England and the American colonies, citizens became outspoken for their courageous causes. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed through the British courts, placing a tax on all paper goods. After being already united once through war, the colonies began the slow process of banding together once again. In Boston, protesters assembled around a regiment of British soldiers in an attempt to vocalize their rights. In the ensuing chaos, the demonstrators were shot. With Boston Harbor subsequently closed and tea being taxed abhorrently, the colonist actions turned blatantly aggressive and revolutionary. The Continental Congress was called in 1774, and the Revolutionary War would begin soon after. The French and Indian War had sewn the colonies together not through mere force, but through great spirit and identity. No longer were there Virginians and New Yorkers, but Americans, fighting for a land known as America. Though many can argue that taxes and proclamations lit an uncontrollable fuse, the reality is that the conflict was inevitable. The colonies realized that they could be independent, and General Washington was ready to prove this once again.